The calm before the storm. The bustling airport terminal thrived with energy as passengers moved in rhythmic chaos, pulling luggage, checking boarding passes, and weaving their way to their gates. Among the crowd were Melanie Carter and her husband, Derek Carter, a couple who seemed to stand out effortlessly. Melanie, a poised and articulate lawyer with an eye for detail, carried herself with quiet confidence. Derek, an accomplished architect known for his innovative designs, walked beside her with the calm assurance of a man accustomed to solving complex problems. Their day had started like any other, smooth, efficient, and planned down to the last detail. They were on their way to a long-overdue vacation, a rare chance to escape the high-pressure demands of their careers. The couple had saved for months to afford this first-class experience, a splurge to reward their hard work. With their tickets in hand, they moved through the airport with ease, exchanging light-hearted jokes as they anticipated the tranquil island retreat awaiting them. At the gate, the airline staff greeted them warmly. Their first-class boarding passes were scanned without issue, and they were ushered down the jet bridge to their seats. The spacious cabin welcomed them with plush leather seats and an air of exclusivity. Melanie and Derek settled into their assigned seats in the first row of first class, ready for the 5-hour journey ahead. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin, ensuring every passenger was comfortable. Among them was Karen Doyle, a senior flight attendant known for her no-nonsense approach. Karen exuded an air of authority, her sharp gaze sweeping over the passengers like a hawk surveying its territory. She was meticulous, sometimes to a fault, and prided herself on maintaining order during flights. As Melanie adjusted her scarf and Derek unfolded his in-flight magazine, Karen's gaze lingered on them. Her brows furrowed slightly, as if something about the couple didn't sit right with her. She approached them briskly, her heels clicking against the cabin floor, and stopped beside their seats. "Excuse me," Karen said, her voice curt but polite. "May I see your boarding passes again?" Melanie looked up, surprised. "Of course," she replied, reaching into her handbag. She handed over the crisp tickets, and Derek followed suit. Karen examined the boarding passes closely, flipping them over and scrutinizing every detail. Her expression grew increasingly skeptical, and she glanced at the couple, then back at the tickets. "These seats don't seem to match," Karen said, her voice louder now, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "I'll need to verify this with the gate agent." Melanie frowned but kept her tone composed. "That's odd. The gate agent confirmed our seats before we boarded." Karen didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned sharply on her heel and disappeared down the aisle, leaving the couple to exchange uneasy glances. The murmurs of other passengers filled the cabin as heads turned toward them. "Do you think this is about us?" Derek asked, keeping his voice low. "I'm not sure," Melanie replied, her lawyer instincts kicking in. "But something feels off." Karen returned a few minutes later, her expression stony. "I'll need you both to step into the galley area so we can resolve this matter privately." The request was unexpected, but Melanie and Derek complied without protest. They gathered their belongings and followed Karen to the small space near the galley, where the air was thick with tension. "I've spoken with the gate agent," Karen began, crossing her arms. "There appears to be an issue with your tickets. These seats were booked under a different name." Melanie raised an eyebrow. "That's impossible," she said, her tone calm but firm. "We booked these seats weeks ago, and the airline confirmed them multiple times. There must be a mistake." Karen's eyes narrowed. "I don't think so. I'm going to call security to sort this out." Derek, sensing the situation escalating unnecessarily, held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Let's not rush to conclusions. Can you show us where the discrepancy is?" Karen hesitated for a moment, but then shook her head. "I don't need to explain myself. Just wait here while I make the call." As Karen turned away, Melanie reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She scrolled through her emails and found the confirmation for their tickets, complete with seat assignments. Derek did the same, both of them prepared to defend their case. Passengers in the cabin craned their necks to see what was happening. Some whispered among themselves, speculating about the couple and the commotion. The businessman seated nearby furrowed his brow and muttered, "This doesn't feel right. They look like they belong here as much as anyone else." Back in the galley, Karen was on the phone with airport security, her voice clipped and authoritative. "We have 2 passengers who are refusing to comply," she said, glancing toward Melanie and Derek. "I need someone here immediately to remove them from the flight." Melanie overheard the conversation and exchanged a glance with Derek. Her calm demeanor remained unshaken. "She's overstepping," Melanie whispered. "I'll handle this." Before Karen could finish her call, Melanie stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "But I'd like to speak with your supervisor before this goes any further." Karen scowled but didn't respond. Melanie took it as an opportunity to dial the airline's customer service line. She explained the situation succinctly, her tone professional yet firm, and requested immediate intervention. The whispers in the cabin grew louder as passengers sensed the tension escalating. The businessman from earlier leaned toward the passenger next to him and said, "This is getting out of hand. They've done nothing wrong." Minutes passed, but the atmosphere remained charged. Karen returned from the galley phone, her expression unreadable. "Security is on their way," she said, addressing Melanie and Derek. "You'll need to wait here until they arrive." Melanie looked at her husband, her lips curling into a faint smile. "It's going to be okay," she said softly. "Just watch." An unexpected ally. The plane hummed softly as it cruised at 30,000 feet, but the tension in the galley near the first-class section was anything but calm. Melanie and Derek stood side by side, their presence calm yet commanding. Despite Karen's escalating accusations, neither raised their voice or faltered. Their unwavering composure was unsettling to the flight attendant, who found herself unnerved by their quiet confidence. Karen had hoped her call to security would be the final word, but she had underestimated her adversaries. Melanie, armed with her legal acumen and an unshakable sense of justice, and Derek, with his steady patience and methodical approach, were not the type to back down. The passengers, who initially paid only passing attention to the commotion, were now fully engaged. Whispers swirled through the cabin like wildfire. "I think I heard her say their tickets were invalid," a young woman muttered to her seatmate. "Invalid?" scoffed the older man across the aisle. "That's ridiculous. I saw them board. They scanned their tickets like everyone else." In the midst of the growing buzz, Clara, a junior flight attendant who had been observing the situation from the sidelines, decided to step forward. Clara was young, fresh out of flight school, and eager to make a good impression. She had admired Karen's efficiency and professionalism, until today. Watching Karen's increasingly hostile behavior toward Melanie and Derek had left Clara feeling uneasy. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her. Summoning her courage, Clara approached Karen, who was hovering near the galley phone, pretending to look busy. "Karen," Clara began hesitantly, her voice soft but firm. "I think we should double-check the passenger manifest. There might have been a mistake." Karen turned sharply, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" "I've already checked everything." Clara's heart raced, but she pressed on. "I mean, it wouldn't hurt to verify. Their tickets were scanned at the gate without any issues." "Maybe." "Enough, Clara," Karen snapped, cutting her off. "This isn't your concern. Just stick to your assigned tasks." Clara took a step back, biting her lip. Her instincts screamed that Karen was wrong, but she didn't have the authority to challenge her senior openly. Instead, she glanced at Melanie and Derek, who had been quietly observing the exchange. Melanie's eyes met Clara's, and for a brief moment there was an unspoken understanding. The power of patience. Derek reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few quick taps, he opened his camera app and began recording. "I hope you don't mind," he said calmly, addressing Karen, "but I'd like to document this interaction for our records." Karen's face hardened. "That won't be necessary," she snapped. "Security will handle this." Melanie stepped forward, her tone steady but assertive. "Actually, documenting incidents like this is entirely within our rights. Considering you've accused us of wrongdoing without providing any evidence, I'd say it's more than necessary." Karen faltered for a moment, her composure cracking. She glanced around, noticing the curious stares from passengers and even a few crew members. The situation was spiraling out of her control, and she knew it. Clara, still standing nearby, saw an opportunity to act. She quickly slipped into the galley and accessed the passenger manifest on the onboard tablet. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through the list, searching for Melanie and Derek's names. When she found them, her stomach dropped. Their names were there, clear as day, assigned to the exact seats they had been occupying. Taking a deep breath, Clara approached Karen again. "Karen," she said firmly, holding the tablet in front of her. "Their names are on the manifest. Their tickets are valid." Karen's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Let me see that," she barked, snatching the tablet from Clara's hands. She stared at the screen, her jaw tightening as she realized the truth. But instead of admitting her mistake, she doubled down. "There's still a discrepancy," Karen said, her voice rising. "It's possible their tickets were switched at the gate. Security will confirm." Melanie crossed her arms, her expression calm but unyielding. "Or perhaps you're grasping at straws to cover up your own assumptions," she said smoothly. "Tell me, Karen, what exactly do you think we've done wrong?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She was caught in her own web of assumptions and could feel the weight of the cabin's judgment pressing down on her. The passengers, once passive observers, were now openly murmuring their discontent. "This is ridiculous," the businessman from earlier said, shaking his head. "They've done nothing wrong." "Exactly," another passenger chimed in. "She's just targeting them for no reason." The tide of public opinion had turned, and Karen was now at the center of a storm she couldn't control. The call that changed everything. Melanie's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced at the screen and smiled faintly. "Excuse me," she said, stepping aside to take the call. "Hello? Yes, this is Melanie Carter. Yes, we're still on board. Thank you. I appreciate your assistance." Karen watched nervously as Melanie ended the call and returned to Derek's side. "That was the airline's executive office," Melanie said, her voice carrying just loud enough for Karen to hear. "They'd been made aware of the situation and are taking immediate action." Karen's face went pale. "The executive office," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Melanie nodded. "That's right. And they were very interested in hearing about how their senior flight attendant has been treating 2 passengers with valid first-class tickets." Before Karen could respond, the plane's intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be making an unscheduled stop at our hub airport to address an onboard matter. We apologize for the inconvenience and will provide updates as soon as possible." The cabin erupted in murmurs of surprise and confusion. Passengers exchanged bewildered glances, and even the crew seemed caught off guard. Karen's composure crumbled completely. She turned to Clara, her voice trembling. "Why are we stopping? What did the captain say?" Clara shrugged, though her expression betrayed a hint of satisfaction. "I guess we're about to find out." An unforeseen twist. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin reached its peak. Karen paced nervously near the galley, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Melanie and Derek, however, remained seated, their calm demeanor unwavering. When the plane landed, a team of airline officials and security personnel was waiting on the tarmac. The cabin doors opened, and the officials stepped inside, their expressions serious. Karen instinctively stepped forward, expecting to explain herself, but the lead official bypassed her completely and approached Melanie and Derek instead. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," the official said, extending a hand. "I'm David Miller, the airline's regional manager. I'd like to personally apologize for the way you've been treated on this flight." Karen's mouth fell open in shock. The passengers, now riveted, watched as the Carter shook hands with the manager. "Thank you, Mr. Miller," Melanie said graciously. "We appreciate your prompt response." Karen tried to interject, but Miller held up a hand. "We'll be speaking with you shortly, Ms. Doyle," he said coldly. "But first, we need to ensure that our passengers are properly accommodated." The reckoning begins. As the aircraft's engines hummed in idle on the tarmac, the passengers sat in stunned silence, their attention focused on the unfolding drama in the first-class cabin. Outside the plane, the bright lights of the airport illuminated a cluster of airline officials and security personnel waiting to board. Inside, tension rippled through the cabin like a live wire, each passenger acutely aware they were witnessing a moment that would be talked about long after this flight was forgotten. Karen stood near the galley, her face pale, and her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She could feel the weight of judgment pressing down from every corner of the cabin. From the passengers, her colleagues, and especially from the Carters. The composed couple, seated calmly in their first-class seats, exuded an aura of quiet strength that only highlighted Karen's unraveling. "Karen Doyle, please step into the galley," came the voice of David Miller, the airline's regional manager, who had boarded with the other officials. His tone was clipped, his eyes hard as he gestured for her to follow him. Karen hesitated, her feet feeling like lead. She glanced around the cabin, her gaze lingering on Clara, the junior flight attendant who had challenged her earlier. Clara gave her a look of quiet sympathy but said nothing. With a deep breath, Karen followed Miller into the galley, where two other officials were waiting. A private confrontation. "Ms. Doyle," Miller began, crossing his arms, "I've reviewed the preliminary details of this incident, and I must say I'm deeply concerned. You escalated a situation involving two passengers with valid tickets, calling security without justification, and caused unnecessary distress to everyone on board." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but Miller held up a hand, cutting her off. "Before you say anything, let me remind you that this conversation is being documented for the airline's internal review. I suggest you choose your words carefully." Karen swallowed hard. I believe there was a mistake," she stammered. "Their demeanor seemed unusual for first-class passengers, and I wanted to ensure there wasn't a ticketing error." Miller's brows furrowed, his voice icy. "Unusual? Can you clarify what you mean by that?" Karen hesitated, realizing too late that her words had already betrayed her. "I just mean, they didn't fit the typical profile off." "Stop right there," Miller snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Are you suggesting that your actions were based on an assumption about their appearance rather than factual evidence?" Karen's face flushed deep red. "I didn't mean it like that," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. Miller took a step closer, his expression unreadable but his tone heavy with authority. "Let me make this clear. This airline does not tolerate discrimination in any form. Your actions have not only put the company in a precarious position, but have also violated our core values." One of the other officials, a woman with a tablet in hand, interjected. "We've already received formal complaints from several passengers, including Mr. and Mrs. Carter. Their legal team has also contacted our executive office. You've created a situation that could lead to serious legal and financial repercussions for the airline." Karen's knees felt weak. "Legal repercussions," she whispered, her voice shaking. "That's correct," the official confirmed. "Mrs. Carter is a renowned attorney with significant influence. She has already indicated that she will pursue legal action unless this matter is resolved to her satisfaction." In the eyes of the passengers, while Karen's fate was being determined in the galley, the main cabin buzzed with whispered conversations. Passengers exchanged theories, frustrations, and indignation about what they had witnessed. "This is appalling," said the businessman from earlier, leaning toward the passenger beside him. "She called security on them because they didn't look like they belonged in first class." "Unbelievable." A young woman nodded in agreement. They were so calm the entire time. If it were me, I'd have been furious. They handled it better than anyone else could have. Clara, moving quietly through the cabin to assist passengers, overheard snippets of the conversation. She felt a surge of admiration for the Carters. Despite everything they had endured, they had remained composed, refusing to stoop to Karen's level. When Clara reached Melanie and Derek's seats, she hesitated before speaking. "Is there anything else I can do for you?" she asked softly, her tone filled with genuine concern. Melanie smiled warmly. "You've already done plenty, Clara. Thank you for stepping in when you did." Clara flushed slightly but nodded. I'm sorry this happened to you. It shouldn't have." Derek gave her a reassuring smile. "You've shown integrity, Clara. That's more than we can say for some." The captain speaks. As the murmurs in the cabin grew louder, Captain Harris emerged from the cockpit. A seasoned pilot with decades of experience, he carried himself with calm authority. He approached the Carter seats, his expression neutral but respectful. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice steady, "I want to personally apologize for the events of this flight. This is not the standard of service we aim to provide, and I assure you that steps are being taken to address the situation." Melanie nodded graciously. "Thank you, Captain Harris. We appreciate your acknowledgement. However, an apology alone won't undo what's happened." The captain inclined his head. "Understood. The airline's executive team is aware of the incident and has assured me that they will handle this matter promptly and thoroughly. If there's anything else I can do to make the remainder of your journey more comfortable, please let me know." Derek leaned forward slightly. "We appreciate your professionalism, Captain. It's clear you value accountability, and that's all we're asking for." The announcement. As the captain returned to the cockpit, Miller re-entered the main cabin. His expression was serious but controlled as he addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience during this matter. I want to assure you that the airline is taking this incident very seriously. To those who were directly impacted, we will be providing compensation for the inconvenience caused today. Additionally, any passengers wishing to provide statements or feedback are encouraged to speak with our team upon deplaning." The passengers nodded in quiet approval, though their glances toward Karen, who was now seated in the galley with her head bowed, made it clear where their sympathies lay. Miller then turned his attention to the Carters. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, we've arranged for a private consultation with our executive team upon your arrival. Your input will be invaluable in ensuring that incidents like this never happen again." Melanie smiled faintly. "We'll be happy to provide our feedback." A dramatic departure. As the plane taxied to its gate, security officers boarded and approached Karen. Her face was ashen as she was escorted off the plane under the watchful eyes of the passengers. The whispers grew louder, a mix of shock, satisfaction, and lingering tension. "That's what she gets," muttered the businessman. "She brought this on herself." Clara watched the scene unfold with mixed emotions. She felt a pang of sympathy for Karen, but also knew that accountability was necessary. As the plane came to a stop and the passengers began to disembark, Melanie and Derek remained seated, allowing the crowd to thin before they rose. Clara approached them one last time. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity, "for everything." Melanie reached out and squeezed Clara's hand. "You have a bright future ahead of you, Clara. Never lose your sense of justice." Derek smiled. "And if you ever need a reference, don't hesitate to reach out." Clara's eyes glistened with gratitude as she nodded. "Thank you." A higher ground. As the passengers disembarked, the whispers followed Karen's dramatic exit from the plane. Melanie and Derek sat patiently, allowing the crowd to thin before gathering their belongings. The cabin, now quiet except for the hum of the engines powering down, felt almost surreal. Clara lingered nearby, unable to pull herself away from the scene. She watched as the Carters remained poised, their every movement deliberate and composed. When the last of the passengers exited, David Miller approached Melanie and Derek. His professional demeanor masked the tension of the moment, but his respect for the couple was evident in his tone. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," Miller began, "we've arranged for a private space in the terminal where you can speak with our executive representatives. Security has already taken Ms. Doyle for questioning, and I want to assure you that we are committed to rectifying this situation." Melanie nodded, her voice calm but firm. "We appreciate that, Mr. Miller. But rectifying the situation isn't just about us. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else." Derek added, "We're not looking for platitudes. We want to see systemic change." Miller's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "Understood. If you'll follow me, we'll get this resolved." The Executive Lounge. The executive lounge at the terminal was a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. Plush chairs, dim lighting, and the soft hum of instrumental music created an atmosphere of calm. Melanie and Derek were seated at a polished wooden table while 3 airline executives joined them. Among them was Rebecca Tran, the head of customer relations, whose reputation for fairness and empathy preceded her. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," Rebecca began, leaning forward with her hands clasped. "First, let me extend my deepest apologies on behalf of the airline. The treatment you experienced on this flight was unacceptable and does not reflect our values." Melanie met Rebecca's gaze, her expression neutral. "Thank you for acknowledging that. But an apology isn't enough." Rebecca nodded. "I understand, and we're prepared to take immediate action. We'd like to hear your perspective first, so we can fully grasp what happened." Melanie took a deep breath, her legal instincts kicking in. Karen Doyle's actions were not just unprofessional, they were rooted in bias. She made assumptions about us based on nothing more than her perception. We were singled out, humiliated, and treated as though we didn't belong. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was systemic discrimination. Derek leaned forward, his voice steady. "This wasn't just about a mistake in customer service. It's about the culture that allowed someone like her to feel empowered to act on prejudice." Rebecca's expression grew serious. "We've already begun an internal review, but your feedback is invaluable. What steps would you like to see us take to address this?" Melanie didn't hesitate. "First, Karen Doyle should be held accountable, not just for us, but to send a message that such behavior won't be tolerated. Second, your staff needs comprehensive bias training. Every employee, from the gate agents to the flight crew, should understand the impact of their actions and decisions. Finally, there needs to be transparency. Incidents like this shouldn't be buried under corporate jargon. Your passengers deserve to know how you're addressing these issues." Rebecca listened intently, taking notes. "Those are fair and actionable points," she said. "We're already reviewing Ms. Doyle's conduct, and I assure you there will be consequences. As for training, we've recently launched a program focused on diversity and inclusion, but I see now that it needs to be more robust." Derek raised an eyebrow. "And transparency?" Rebecca hesitated but nodded. "We'll issue a public statement addressing this incident and outlining the steps we're taking. It's the least we can do." Melanie's lips curled into a faint smile. "Good, because this isn't just about us. It's about setting a precedent. Karen's fate." Meanwhile, in another part of the terminal, Karen sat in a small, nondescript room with a single table and 2 chairs. Her hands trembled as she waited, the weight of her actions bearing down on her. A security officer stood near the door, his expression unreadable, while another official entered with a file in hand. "Ms. Doyle," the official began, sitting across from her, "we've completed a preliminary review of the incident on Flight 215. I want to give you an opportunity to explain your actions." Karen fidgeted with her hands. I was just doing my job," she said weakly. "I thought there was an issue with their tickets." The official raised an eyebrow. "Despite the fact that their tickets were valid and confirmed by multiple systems, despite your colleague bringing the manifest to your attention." Karen's voice cracked. I didn't think they fit the profile of first-class passengers. I was trying to prevent fraud. The official's expression hardened. Ms. Doyle, your actions were not only unprofessional but discriminatory. You targeted passengers based on your personal biases, not evidence. This has put the airline at significant legal and reputational risk. Karen's shoulders slumped, tears welling in her eyes. I didn't mean for this to happen. Intent doesn't excuse impact, the official replied sharply. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending further investigation. Depending on the outcome, termination and additional legal consequences may follow. Karen buried her face in her hands as the gravity of her situation sank in. For the first time, she realized the full scope of her mistake. A call for change. Back in the lounge, Melanie and Derek were wrapping up their conversation with Rebecca. The executives had committed to their demands, and it was clear that their voices had been heard. Before we go, Melanie said, standing up, I want to emphasize one thing. What happened today wasn't unique to us. Incidents like this happen every day, often to people without the resources or platform to fight back. If your airline truly wants to be a leader in this industry, you'll make this a turning point. Rebecca stood as well, extending her hand. Thank you, Mrs. Carter. Your feedback will guide our efforts moving forward. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have further concerns. As the Carters exited the lounge, they were met with quiet applause from a small group of passengers who had stayed behind to watch the aftermath. Clara was among them, her face glowing with admiration. Thank you, Clara said softly, for standing up. For all of us. Melanie smiled. It's not just about standing up. It's about staying standing. Keep doing the right thing, Clara. Derek nodded in agreement. You've got potential. Don't let anyone dim it. Moving forward. As they left the terminal, Melanie and Derek felt a sense of closure. The fight wasn't over, but they had taken the first steps toward holding the airline accountable and setting a precedent for change. In the days that followed, the airline issued a public apology and announced sweeping changes to its training programs and accountability measures. Karen Doyle's suspension turned into termination, and the incident became a case study for corporate responsibility. For Melanie and Derek, the experience served as a reminder of the importance of persistence, dignity, and using one's voice to demand justice, not just for oneself, but for those who couldn't. The ripple effect. The story of what transpired on Flight 215 began spreading even before Melanie and Derek Carter stepped off the plane. Passengers had recorded snippets of the incident, uploading videos to social media with captions like "discrimination in the skies" and "first-class passengers wrongfully accused." Within hours, the hashtags #Flight215 and #JusticeForCarters were trending. By the time Melanie and Derek reached their hotel that evening, their phones were inundated with messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers offering support. News outlets began picking up the story, some reaching out to Melanie directly for a comment. She and Derek decided to remain composed, choosing their words carefully to emphasize accountability and systemic change rather than personal grievances. A growing movement. The following morning, a journalist from a major network contacted Melanie. The reporter, Samantha Nguyen, was known for her investigative approach and passion for uncovering injustices. Mrs. Carter, Samantha began during the call, your story is resonating with people across the country. Would you be willing to sit down for an interview? I think your voice could spark an important conversation. Melanie hesitated. She wasn't seeking fame or attention. Her goal was to ensure that what happened to her and Derek didn't happen to anyone else. Derek, sitting beside her, noticed her thoughtful expression. You've always said change starts with speaking up, he reminded her gently. This might be the opportunity to do just that. Melanie nodded, her resolve solidifying. Let's do it, she told Samantha. The interview was scheduled for the following day. When the time came, Melanie and Derek arrived at the studio, dressed in professional yet approachable attire. Samantha greeted them warmly, her admiration for their poise evident. The interview. The interview began with Samantha providing a brief summary of the incident, accompanied by clips from passenger videos. The footage showed Karen Doyle speaking harshly to Melanie and Derek, their composed responses, and the murmurs of support from fellow passengers. "Mrs. Carter," Samantha began, turning to Melanie, "can you walk us through what happened that day and how it felt to be targeted so unfairly?" Melanie leaned forward slightly, her voice steady and measured. "It was disheartening," she said. "My husband and I were excited about a much-needed getaway, only to find ourselves accused of wrongdoing based on nothing more than someone's assumptions. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was humiliating." Derek added, "What stood out to us was the lack of accountability in the moment. Despite presenting valid tickets and maintaining our composure, we were treated as though we were intruding in a space we didn't belong to." Samantha nodded, her expression serious. "Many viewers have commented on how calm and composed you both remained during the incident. How did you manage to stay so grounded?" Melanie smiled faintly. "As an attorney, I've learned that staying calm under pressure is crucial. But more than that, we knew this wasn't just about us. If we reacted emotionally, it might have overshadowed the larger issue." Derek chimed in. "We wanted to handle the situation in a way that couldn't be dismissed as overreaction. Our goal was to shine a light on the broader problem, not just defend ourselves." Samantha shifted the focus. "What would you like to see happen moving forward, both with the airline and in the broader conversation about bias and accountability?" Melanie's expression grew serious. "The airline needs to take concrete steps, implementing stronger training, fostering a culture of inclusivity, and holding employees accountable. But this isn't just about one company. It's about addressing the underlying biases that permeate all industries and ensuring that everyone, regardless of appearance or background, is treated with dignity." Public reaction. The interview aired that evening, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Viewers flooded social media with messages of support for the Carters, praising their grace under pressure and their call for systemic change. Advocacy groups reached out, offering to collaborate on initiatives to address discrimination in the travel industry. The airline, already reeling from the backlash, issued a second, more detailed statement. They announced the immediate termination of Karen Doyle's employment and outlined a series of measures to address the issues raised by the Carters. These included mandatory bias training. All employees, from ground staff to executives, would undergo rigorous training to address implicit biases and ensure equitable treatment of passengers. Passenger advocate role. A new role would be created to assist passengers in resolving disputes without escalation. Independent oversight. A third-party firm would conduct periodic audits to assess the airline's progress in fostering an inclusive culture. Despite these efforts, the public remained skeptical. Many saw the measures as reactive rather than proactive, a way to salvage the airline's reputation rather than a genuine commitment to change. Karen Doyle's perspective. Meanwhile, Karen Doyle faced her own reckoning. Jobless and ostracized, she struggled to come to terms with her actions. The videos circulating online painted an unflattering picture of her, and she couldn't escape the judgment of others or herself. Sitting alone in her small apartment, Karen replayed the events of that day in her mind. She realized she had acted out of fear and prejudice, making snap judgments without considering the harm she was causing. For the first time, she acknowledged the biases she had carried for years. One evening, she decided to write a letter to the Carters. She struggled with the words, erasing and rewriting sentences until she felt they conveyed her regret. A letter of apology. A week later, Melanie and Derek received Karen's letter in the mail. It read, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Carter, I am writing to express my deepest apologies for my actions on Flight 215. There is no excuse for how I treated you, and I take full responsibility for the harm I caused. My assumptions and biases led to an unjust situation, and I deeply regret the pain and humiliation I caused you both. Since the incident, I have taken time to reflect on my actions and the beliefs that influenced them. I am committed to educating myself and confronting the biases that led me to make such poor decisions. I understand that my apology may not erase what happened, but I hope it conveys my genuine remorse. I am truly sorry for how I treated you, and will work to ensure that I never repeat such mistakes. Sincerely, Karen Doyle. Melanie read the letter aloud to Derek, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. "Do you believe her?" Derek asked. Melanie thought for a moment. "I think she's trying," she said finally. And that's a start. A call to action. Inspired by the overwhelming response to their story, Melanie and Derek partnered with advocacy organizations to launch an initiative called Skyward Justice. The program aimed to address systemic discrimination in the travel industry through training, advocacy, and public awareness campaigns. Their first public event drew hundreds of attendees, including passengers from Flight 215, airline employees, and industry leaders. Clara, the junior flight attendant, was among them. She approached the Carters after their keynote speech, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't just stand up for yourselves. You stood up for all of us." Melanie smiled, placing a hand on Clara's shoulder. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said, "but it starts with moments like this." Derek added, "And with people like you, Clara. Keep doing the right thing." Building a legacy. Months after the incident on Flight 215, the ripple effects were still being felt. Melanie and Derek Carter had transformed their experience into a larger movement, using their platform to advocate for systemic change in the travel industry and beyond. Their initiative, Skyward Justice, had gained significant traction, attracting support from advocacy groups, travelers, and even employees within the airline industry. What started as a fight for accountability had grown into a mission to redefine how people were treated, not just in first-class cabins, but everywhere. The global spotlight. Media coverage of the Carters' work brought their message to a global audience. Major networks featured them in interviews, with headlines like "From Humiliation to Hope: How One Couple is Changing the Skies." Their story was even adapted into a documentary, Flight to Justice, which explored the incident and the broader issues of bias and discrimination in the travel industry. The documentary became a sensation, sparking discussions in boardrooms, classrooms, and community centers around the world. Viewer comments flooded in, many sharing their own experiences with prejudice and thanking the Carters for shedding light on an issue often swept under the rug. One such comment read, "As someone who was once escorted off a flight for looking suspicious while carrying a perfectly valid ticket, I can't thank the Carters enough. Their courage gives people like me hope that things can change." Another said, "This isn't just about flying. It's about every space where people are made to feel like they don't belong." Melanie and Derek are paving the way for real change. Clara's new role. Clara, the young flight attendant who had supported the Carters during the incident, found herself thrust into the spotlight as well. Her actions were widely praised, and she became an unexpected hero in the story. Inspired by Melanie and Derek, Clara began advocating for change within her airline. Recognizing her potential, the airline's leadership promoted Clara to a new role, Diversity and Inclusion Liaison. In her new position, she worked directly with the airline's executive team to implement the changes Melanie and Derek had pushed for, including mandatory bias training and a system for passengers to report incidents without fear of retaliation. Clara also collaborated with the Carters on Skyward Justice initiatives, becoming one of the program's most vocal advocates. At a press conference, she spoke candidly about the need for change. "I saw firsthand how biases can harm not just individuals but entire systems. It's not enough to say we're sorry after the fact. We need to create environments where everyone feels respected and valued from the start." Karen Doyle's transformation. For Karen Doyle, the fallout from the incident was devastating but transformative. After losing her job and facing widespread criticism, she took a hard look at herself and the biases that had influenced her actions. She enrolled in diversity and equity workshops, sought therapy, and volunteered with organizations that work to combat discrimination. Karen also reached out to the Carters through Skyward Justice. At first, Melanie and Derek were hesitant to involve her, unsure if her intentions were genuine. But after much deliberation, they decided to meet with her. When they finally sat across from Karen in a small conference room, the tension was palpable. Karen, visibly nervous, began by thanking them for agreeing to the meeting. "I know I can never undo what I did," Karen said, her voice trembling. "But I want to help make sure it doesn't happen again. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want to be part of the solution." Melanie studied her for a moment before responding. "Change starts with accountability," she said. "If you're serious about making amends, your actions will speak louder than your words." Karen nodded, her determination evident. Over time, she became an active volunteer for Skyward Justice, sharing her story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked biases. Her involvement, though met with skepticism at first, became a powerful example of personal growth and redemption. A seat at the table. The Carters' advocacy didn't stop with the travel industry. They began working with policymakers to address broader issues of discrimination and bias across industries. Melanie's legal expertise and Derek's strategic thinking made them a formidable team, and their efforts led to the creation of the Inclusive Spaces Act, legislation aimed at promoting equity and inclusion in public and private spaces. The act included provisions for mandatory bias training, transparency in customer service policies, and stronger protections against discrimination. When the bill passed, Melanie and Derek were invited to the signing ceremony, where they stood beside lawmakers as the legislation was enacted. A flight reimagined. 1 year after the incident, the airline invited the Carters to a special event celebrating the changes they had inspired. The airline's CEO, Rebecca Tran, personally escorted them onto a new flagship aircraft named the Carter in honor of their contributions. "This is more than a plane," Rebecca said during her speech. "It's a symbol of how far we've come and a reminder of the work still ahead." The Carters taught us that inclusion isn't just a goal, it's a responsibility. The Carters were given lifetime access to first-class travel with the airline, a gesture that symbolized the airline's commitment to doing better. Melanie and Derek graciously accepted, but made it clear that their focus remained on the mission. "We're not here for perks," Melanie said during her remarks. "We're here to ensure that no one else has to fight the way we did to be treated with dignity." A legacy of change. As Skyward Justice expanded, it became a global movement, partnering with other organizations to address bias and discrimination in healthcare, education, and the workplace. Melanie and Derek traveled the world, speaking at conferences and mentoring young advocates who shared their vision for a more inclusive future. Their story became a beacon of hope, proving that even in the face of adversity, change was possible. And while they never sought fame, they embraced their role as catalysts for a better, fairer world. In a quiet moment at home, Derek looked at Melanie as she worked on a speech for an upcoming event. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been if we hadn't stood up that day?" he asked. Melanie paused, a thoughtful smile spreading across her face. "All the time," she admitted. "But sometimes the hardest moments lead to the most important changes." Derek nodded. "Here's to making the skies and the world a better place." Melanie raised her glass in agreement. "Here's to justice. The impact takes flight." As the Carters' advocacy gained momentum, the world began to see the profound effects of their work. Beyond the travel industry, their story inspired conversations in homes, schools, and workplaces. Social media campaigns, community discussions, and corporate seminars sprang up, each aiming to confront and dismantle systemic bias. The phrase "do it for the Carters" became a rallying cry for standing against discrimination. Karen's continued redemption. Karen Doyle, now a vocal advocate for change, worked tirelessly to transform her mistake into a positive impact. She participated in town halls, shared her story at corporate workshops, and even collaborated on an educational video series for Skyward Justice. Her openness about her failures and commitment to learning resonated with people who saw themselves in her journey. At one workshop, a participant approached her after her presentation. "Hearing you admit your mistakes gave me the courage to look at my own biases," the young woman said. "I've always thought of myself as fair, but your story made me realize I have work to do." Karen smiled, her gratitude evident. "If my story can help even one person confront their biases, then it was worth sharing." The sky's the limit. The success of Skyward Justice led Melanie and Derek to expand their mission. They launched Grounded Equity, a sister initiative focused on combating discrimination in ground-based industries like retail, hospitality, and public transportation. The programs emphasized practical tools for fostering inclusive environments and offered resources for individuals who had faced discrimination. At the launch event for Grounded Equity, Melanie spoke to a packed audience. "Change isn't just about policies," she said. "It's about people. It's about how we treat one another every single day. We're here to create a world where everyone feels they belong." A journey comes full circle. 1 year to the day after the incident on Flight 215, the Carters were invited to speak at a global aviation summit. The event was held in the very city where their vacation had been cut short, a poetic reminder of how far they, and the industry, had come. Dressed elegantly, Melanie and Derek walked onto the stage to a standing ovation. The audience included airline executives, flight attendants, passengers, and policymakers from around the world. Clara was in attendance, sitting in the front row, her eyes shining with pride. Melanie began the speech. "A year ago, my husband and I boarded a plane expecting a peaceful trip. What we experienced instead was a harsh reminder of how deeply ingrained biases can be, even in the most mundane moments." Derek continued, "But what happened after that flight was extraordinary. People from all walks of life came together to say, 'Enough is enough. The work isn't over, but we've proven that change is possible when we hold each other accountable and stand for what's right.'" They ended their speech with a simple yet powerful message. It's not about where you sit on a plane. It's about ensuring that dignity and respect are the standard for everyone, everywhere. A new horizon. After the summit, the Carters took some time to reflect. They sat together on the balcony of their home, overlooking the serene landscape. For the first time in months, they allowed themselves a moment to breathe, knowing that the seeds they had planted were growing. "What's next for us?" Derek asked, leaning back in his chair. Melanie smiled thoughtfully. "We keep going, one step at a time, one conversation at a time. But first," she reached for a travel brochure on the table, flipping it open to a page featuring a secluded island retreat. "I think we owe ourselves the vacation we never had." Derek chuckled. "This time, no drama. Just us." Melanie raised her glass. "Just us. A legacy takes flight." The Carters' story became a lasting symbol of courage and resilience. Airlines around the world adopted Skyward Justice's framework, transforming their training and policies. Clara rose through the ranks, eventually becoming an executive known for championing inclusivity. Karen Doyle continued her advocacy, proving that redemption was possible with genuine effort. As the Carters boarded their flight to the island, they were greeted warmly by the flight crew, who knew exactly who they were. Melanie and Derek settled into their seats, exchanging a quiet smile. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored to welcome 2 passengers today who remind us of the power of standing up for what's right. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, thank you for helping us all reach higher." The passengers applauded, and for the first time in a long time, Melanie and Derek felt a profound sense of peace. They had turned their pain into purpose, their setback into a movement. The skies above them stretched endlessly, a fitting metaphor for the future they had helped create. And with that, the plane ascended into the clouds, carrying them toward a well-deserved horizon of rest, renewal, and hope.